fair to say the recent proposal of including SMSFs in the Retirement Income Covenant, as outlined in a discussion paper released by Treasury last year, has prompted a degree of discussion within the sector about the fundamental role of SMSFs in the superannuation system. This covenant would mandate superannuation funds to offer appropriate retirement income options and outcomes for members. I'm very fortunate to have Natasha Panagis, Head of Superannuation and Financial Services at the Institute of Financial Professionals Australia, with me today to dive more deeply into this issue. Good morning, Natasha. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Morning, Todd. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Natasha, I understand that IFPA believes SMSFs should be excluded from the Retirement Income Covenant. Can you explain why IFPA holds this position?
Yeah, of course. Look, that's right, Todd. Look, given most self-managed super fund trustees are approaching or are already in retirement, we find that they're already highly engaged and actively involved in the management of their super and retirement savings. So we think that a retirement income covenant, or a RIC, obligation would just place further cost, further complexity and more red tape obligations on SMSF trustees without any benefit to members or their retirement needs. If we take a step back to have a look at when the RIC commenced, that was back on the 1st of July 2022. And the RIC effectively requires super funds to propose a suitable retirement income products and outcomes for their members. But when the RIC was being discussed, it was decided back then that SMSFs would be excluded from it. And that was mainly not to burden trustees with more unnecessary red tape due to the potential duplication or the overlap between the SMSF's investment strategy and the RIC. And this is because there are several components of the RIC that are addressed in the existing investment strategy of a fund. And that includes things like the risk, the liquidity, investment objectives, cash flow requirements, diversification, which all can be documented at either the fund level or the member level. So we also know that the law requires trustees to regularly review and formulate an investment strategy that gives regard to all of the circumstances of the fund, and they must do this at least on an annual basis. So just having another covenant will cause more confusion for trustees because they're already considering the investment composition and the risk for their entire fund. So for all of these reasons, we don't think there's a need for another covenant to dictate how trustees and members should manage their retirement savings, because the framework already exists for members and trustees to take on this important responsibility.
I know one idea that has been raised is that if the government is really intent on improving the retirement outcomes for SMSF trustees and members through including them in the covenant, perhaps they should be looking at ways at sort of beefing up or improving that annual requirement to formulate a investment strategy. Do you think that that's an idea that has any merit?
I think the idea may work rather than having both an annual investment strategy requirement and the retirement income covenant for trustees to adhere to. So having one would work. Practically speaking, it would make sense for SMSF trustees to address the expected risks associated with a member's expected retirement income as part of their overall investment strategy, if they're not already doing this. So the investment strategy of the fund, in our view, should be all-encompassing. It should explain how a fund's investments will meet each member's retirement objectives, which will obviously factor in both accumulation phase and retirement phase interests. We've also seen the regulators, in particular the ATO, take more of a prominent role in educating SMSF trustees on their roles and responsibilities. And we've seen a lot of education collateral and compliance campaigns that the ATO has released that have helped improve the knowledge and the behaviours of SMSF trustees. And so we think that the regulator should continue these activities because they will help improve the quality and the standard of SMSF investment strategies. And as a result, it would mean that educated trustees will have a better chance of considering the income needs of the members of the fund. But to your point or your question about improving the annual requirement, we know that SMSF trustees are also currently required to review their strategy more regularly than on an annual basis if certain significant events occur. And they may be things like a market correction, or if a new member joins a fund or leaves a fund, or where a member starts receiving a pension. And to this point, that's important because reviewing the retirement income strategy here is important to ensure that the fund has sufficient liquid assets and cash flow to help the member meet their minimum pension payments before 30 June each year. So most, if not all, SMSF trustees are already quite focused on their investment strategy, which is great. But I think changing the rules and potentially mandating that it must be updated more frequently than what is already required would be excessive, in my opinion.
If by chance SMSFs are included into the retirement income covenant, obviously it hasn't happened yet, but if it does by chance happen at a point in the future, what do you think? You touched on this before, but what do you think might change in the day-to-day running or of a fund for SMSF trustees and members? For example, would there be that added administrative burden that you referred to before?
Yeah, definitely. The impact on trustees and also practitioners will be burdensome. As I mentioned earlier, the addition of the retirement income covenant for trustees would add more cost, more complexity to the admin of an SMSF for little gain or little benefit. Unlike trustees of large APRA funds, SMSF members and trustees are generally the same person, and they already formulate and give effect to an investment strategy for all members of the fund, which are themselves. So there's no need to introduce another covenant to do that. The other issue I should mention will also, from a practitioner's point of view, will be for SMSF auditors, because a retirement income covenant would therefore broaden the scope of the audit undertaken by the SMSF auditor. Because the RIC aims to consider holistic retirement income considerations from both sources inside and outside of the super system, the determination of a member's retirement income needs, auditors will need to consider this information to determine whether trustees have complied with the retirement income strategy. So extending the scope out and extending the audit to check compliance with the RIC will also lead to more red tape and increase the time, complexity, and the cost of the audit for the auditor and also for the fund as well. At the end of the day, the RIC is still a relatively new element of super policy. We think it's too soon to determine its effectiveness or the outcomes from its implementation. Large APRA funds are still trying to work out how to best engage with their members to fulfil their obligations under the RIC. So I think we just need to carefully monitor this and monitor this over time, particularly with the quality of advice review reforms that are going on in the background. But in a nutshell, we think it's critical that a member's retirement income strategy is carefully considered and laid out. We just think that this should be included in the SMSF's existing investment strategy rather than introduce another covenant for trustees to adhere to.
Very good. As I mentioned previously, Natasha is the head of superannuation and financial services at the Institute of Financial Professionals Australia, and the Institute has recently held their annual conference in Melbourne. Natasha, thanks so much for joining me again today, and I hope to speak with you again very soon.
Thanks, Todd. Thanks for having me on the show.